The muggy Port Charles air was laden with unset tensions and seething resentments. Willow Tate's last few months had been a never-ending barrage of emotional upheaval, culminating in the heartbreaking custody decision that granted Michael complete physical and legal custody of Wiley and Amelia. It was a decision that had broken her world, leaving her spinning and disoriented, with Drew Kane as her only anchor in a maelstrom of public censure and personal anguish. She had been quite confident that her love for her children, her identity as their mother, would triumph. Drew's increasingly passionate and persuasive arguments had just strengthened her resolve, telling her she deserved to win and Michael was trying to punish her. However, the judge's words had sliced through her carefully crafted reality like a surgeon's scalpel, dissecting her choices and exposing her apparent neglect and disrespect for her children's well-being. However, the ultimate awakening, the profound and terrible knowledge of the scandal she had unintentionally become entangled in, would not occur with a single stroke. It would be a series of 3 gut punches, each ripping away another layer of her self-deception, forcing her to confront the raw, unadorned truth of her predicament and Drew's negative role. The first gut blow came quietly, a cold whisper rather than a roar, but it reverberated with an icy clarity that cut through her sadness. It worried Drew, the man she had given so much for, the man who had promised her everything. Willow had been attempting to re-establish some sort of routine, making rough preparations for how she would handle visits with Wiley and Amelia, still hoping Drew would assist her in finding a way to reverse the custody decision, or at least reduce its consequences. She was in Kelly's, nursing a lukewarm coffee, when she overheard Sonny Corinthos and Jason Morgan talking quietly. They were discussing about Drew, his political ambitions, and how he used certain events to his advantage. Willow, still reeling from her own emotional turmoil, dismissed it as typical Port Charles gossip, but a specific phrase caught her attention. He'd stoop to anything to get what he wants, even if it means hurting the people closest to him. Jason's voice was grim, and his eyes held a familiar weariness that Willow had often associated with the darker side of the Corinthos world. Sonny, who is normally more straightforward, appeared especially melancholy. "He manipulated Wiley, Jason," Sonny murmured, his voice barely audible, but Willow felt the words like a physical blow. "Told him Michael didn't want him anymore, just so he could turn Willow against Michael." It was a low blow even for Drew. Willow froze, her blood turning icy. Michael confronted her in court about Drew's manipulation of Wiley, stating Drew informed Wiley that Michael no longer wanted him or Amelia due to his new kid, Daisy. Willow had vehemently defended Drew at the time, dismissing Michael's charges as desperate attempts to gain custody, believing Wiley had simply misunderstood, or that Michael was exaggerating. Drew had strongly disputed it, embracing her and portraying Michael as unwell. She had believed him, held to his words like a lifeline, wanting to prove Michael wrong and trust in her feelings for Drew. But hearing Sonny and Jason, 2 guys who saw through facades and knew the darker machinations of their society, confirm it with such solemn conviction, she felt a dreadful lurch in her gut. Drew had not only denied it, but lied to her face, brilliantly constructing a story that turned Michael's anguish into vindictiveness. He had not protected her. Rather, he had exploited her mother instincts and need for justice to forward his own agenda against Michael. His seeming steadfast support had been a deliberate display. The affair, the impassioned declarations, the shared future he envisioned, everything felt contaminated, hollowed out by this terrifying discovery of his cruel manipulation. Willow departed Kelly's, the coffee untouched, the diner's joyful conversation, a stark contrast to the inward scream that was developing within her. She found herself wandering aimlessly through the familiar streets of Port Charles, the brightness doing nothing to lift the gathering darkness in her head. Drew's loving glance, reassuring embrace, and furious commitment to fight for her were all replayed in her thoughts, accompanied by the sinister shadow of his deception. This wasn't simply a falsehood about Wiley, it was a lie about both him and them. Drew's manipulation of her fragile son, twisting a child's naive understanding for his own strategic gain, was an inexcusable crime, a moral line crossed that Willow despised. She had survived a cult and learned the hard way about manipulation and false prophets, but now she was unintentionally walking into another, albeit subtler, kind of control. The scandal began to take shape for her, not merely as a public disgrace, but also as a subtle, insidious corrosion of her own moral compass, directed by Drew's clever hand. She realized she had been complicit, allowing her allegiance to blind her to the warning signs. The taste of treachery was acidic, far stronger than any coffee, scorching her throat with its terrible truth. The second stomach punch was quick, emotional, and came straight from the source of her greatest love, her children. It was Wiley and Amelia's visitation day, and she approached it with a mix of frantic optimism and lingering despair. She arrived at Michael's, attempting to maintain a cool, composed demeanor despite the raging storm within her. Wiley, who was normally excited about their time together, appeared withdrawn, his brilliant eyes muted. Amelia, still so small, clutched to Michael's knee and looked at Willow with rare caution. Willow tried to engage Wiley by inquiring about his day at school and his favorite toys. He mumbled short, evasive answers, his gaze shifting between her and Michael. After a tense silence, Michael softly squatted down to Wiley's level. "Hey buddy," he whispered softly. "Is there something on your mind? You can talk about anything, you know that." Wiley nodded, then stared directly at Willow, his small voice shaking. "Mommy, why did you say Daddy didn't want us anymore?" The word struck Willow like a physical blow, harsher and more devastating than any legal verdict. Her breath caught. This was the raw, unadulterated result of Drew's deception, as attested immediately by her son. It wasn't just a rumor or a legal strategy. It was a seed of doubt sown in Wiley's innocent mind that grew and caused him agony. She saw deep perplexity and hurt in his eyes, which was reflected by Amelia's mute anxiety. Her heart contracted into a tight, excruciating knot. All of her explanations, her urgent want to trust Drew, fell in the face of her son's honest questioning. She saw the full cost of her blind loyalty, as well as the conflict's impact on the most vulnerable among them. The shame was tremendous, a flood of self-reproach that threatened to drown her. This was the actual scandal, the harm she had permitted to be done to her children, the very being she pledged to protect above all else. Michael intervened when he saw Willow's distressed expression. "Wiley, we talked about this. Daddy always wants you and Amelia. Mommy knows that. Sometimes grown-ups say things when they're upset, but it doesn't mean they're true." His words were gentle, meant to reassure Wiley, but they were also a quiet indictment of Willow, a reminder of her past dismissal of his concerns. Willow could hardly talk. She crouched and reached for Wiley, her words strangled with tears. "Oh sweetie, no, that's not true. Daddy loves you so much. And Mommy loves you. We both love you more than anything in the world." But the words were empty, inadequate, unable to erase the bewilderment and anguish in his eyes. She felt the weight of her irresponsibility, her inability to look above her own pain, and Drew's deceptive comfort. She had been so absorbed by the fight and the desire to win custody that she had failed to properly protect her children from the ugliness of the battle itself. This was the harsh result of her decisions, far more devastating than any legal failure. She recognized with sickening clarity that Michael, despite his rage and anguish, had repeatedly prioritized the children, attempting to shelter them from the worst of the consequences. She, on the other hand, had allowed herself to be led astray, putting her wounded pride and Drew's agenda ahead of the emotional health of her fragile children. The gravity of her failure as a mother in this case was overwhelming, leaving her breathless with remorse and sadness. The scandal she needed to scent wasn't simply public. It was a deeply personal moral flaw, a betrayal of her own essential principles. The final gut punch was delivered publicly, a harsh expose that left no space for denial, forcing Willow to accept the full scope of the scandal she was now indelibly linked to. It wasn't simply Drew's previous manipulations or the consequences for her children. It was also her complicity, perceived lack of judgment, and the deterioration of her reputation in Port Charles. The backdrop was the nurses' ball, which is typically associated with charity and communal enthusiasm, but this year it became a platform for Willow's reckoning. She arrived with Drew, putting on a brave face and attempting to project a sense of normalcy. However, they were followed by whispers, knowing glances and palpable anxiety from others who had observed the hard custody struggle and Drew's increasingly questionable acts. Willow, despite her ongoing pain, had hoped that time would heal the scars, and that her society would ultimately understand. The blow came during a live broadcast segment, an unexpected, unannounced report from a local investigative journalist, a protege of someone Willow had admired, who had been secretly researching the recent court processes and the numerous allegations about Drew's behavior. Standing on the red carpet, the journalist discussed the recent custody ruling, noting the judge's extremely harsh comments regarding Willow's negligent and selfish behavior, disrespect for the children's welfare, and decision to reject Michael's custodial rights. But then the writer released the true bombshell, a piece of information that had seemingly just surfaced, a leaked detail from the court's confidential records, or even an anonymous tip from someone in Drew's own circle. The report described how Drew allegedly used his political clout and connections to try to sway the judge, not directly through blackmail, but through subtle pressure, veiled threats to the judge's career, and planting negative stories about Michael in various publications leading up to the trial. The report even alluded to Drew's alleged attempt to falsify evidence, but stopped short of charging him directly. In a tragic twist of fate, the camera focused on Willow's face as the claims were broadcast, capturing her abrupt pallor and the quiver in her fingers as she automatically gripped Drew's arm. Her heart pounded against her ribs, like a frenzied bird caught in a cage. Drew alongside her was visibly upset, his customary calm cracking as he tried to draw her away, murmuring furious denials. Unfortunately, it was too late. The damage was done. The journalist ended the segment with a pointed question to the audience. What does this say about those who stand by him, those who benefited from his questionable tactics? The implication was clear. Willow was more than just a victim. She was a willing participant, blinded by her attachment to Drew. The crowd's roar, which began as a jubilant murmur, evolved into a deep, unsettling hum, followed by open shouts of astonishment and disapproval. People turned to stare, their expressions marked with disgust, pity, and judging curiosity. Willow felt their gaze on her, thousands of unseen needles stinging her skin. The scandal she had detected, if faintly, had now enveloped her in a suffocating fog of public disgrace. This was no longer a private problem. It was front-page news, a scandal developing in front of the entire city of Port Charles. She remembered Nina's prior charges against Drew, and how he had manipulated Willow in court, portraying her as a bad mother. Nina, despite her troubled relationship with Willow, saw it and tried to warn Drew away. Willow rejected it as Nina's own bitterness. The harsh truth struck into her with full force. The combined force of these three stomach punches, Drew's cold, deliberate manipulation of Wiley and her, the catastrophic impact on her children's mental well-being, and the public shaming that exposed her cooperation and poor judgment, left Willow completely broken but unquestionably awake. The delusion she had been living, the cozy lie that Drew was her noble guardian, and that her decisions were justifiable, had crumbled into a million pieces. Drew had not only been fighting Michael, he had been fighting Michael through her, using her emotional vulnerability and love for her children as pawns in a greater game of power and revenge. His love had been a gilded cage, trapping her in a cycle of denial and poor choices. The lady who had emerged from a cult, tough and ready to forge her own path, had, unfortunately, let herself to be shaped by another domineering personality, disguised as Love 2.2. Willow, who had once fiercely shielded Wiley from Shiloh, her manipulative biological father, had, in a horrifying parallel, enabled Drew to inflict a different type of trauma on her son while she stood by his side. The knowledge served as a terrible mirror, reflecting a version of herself she barely knew, one that had lost her moral compass and compromised her own essential principles. Willow retreated following the nurse's ball catastrophe, her public humiliation worsened by the crushing weight of her private admissions. She walled herself away, unwilling to see Drew, since the mere notion of his presence made her nauseous. The silence in her room was no longer calm, it was filled with echoes of her blunders, her children's screams, and Port Charles's judgmental whispers. She repeated every interaction, conversation, and decision, viewing them through this new, awful prism of reality. Her initial incredulity, rage at Michael, and steadfast faith in Drew all felt like tragic delusions. The days that followed were a flurry of tears and painstaking reflection. She reflected on her background, her path, and the strong, independent woman she had once aspired to be. She remembered her early days with Michael, their basic, honest love, free of secrets and ambitions. She remembered his efforts at compromise and his unwavering concern for their children, even when she was unwilling to reciprocate. The talk with Sasha, in which they had spoken candidly about past hurts and future hopes, now felt like a prophetic moment, a subtle prod toward truth and healing that she had been too blind to notice. Sasha too had made mistakes, but she had confronted and accepted them, and she was now constructing a life based on honesty and self-awareness. Willow saw that her stubbornness, her all-or-nothing approach to custody, spurred by Drew's influence, had cost her not just physical custody of her children, but also destroyed her credibility, self-esteem, and social status. She had been so focused on winning that she had forgotten what it genuinely meant to be a good mother, putting the children's serenity, stability, and emotional well-being first and foremost. The scandal was caused not just by Drew's tactics, but also by her own decline, her readiness to sacrifice her ethics for the sake of a perceived victory. The issue before her now was not about winning a legal case, but about reconstructing her life, reclaiming her identity, and regaining the trust of her children and possibly Michael. It would be a long, difficult trek. She knew she had to cut all links with Drew, not just emotionally but fully, in order to free herself from his manipulative grip. She had to apologize to Michael, not just for the public spectacle, but for every falsehood, every misdirected charge, and every instance in which she had put Drew's agenda ahead of their children's tranquility. Most importantly, she had to demonstrate to Wiley and Amelia via her actions that their mother was actually present for them, clear-headed and committed, free of the shadows of conflict and manipulation. The scandal had finally jolted Willow awake. The odor was caustic, assaulting her nostrils, a stench of falsehood and self-delusion. But behind the smell, a faint, almost imperceptible scent of regeneration began to emerge, a delicate promise of a future in which Willow Tate, stripped of illusions, could finally begin to heal, to genuinely understand what it meant to be a mother, a friend, and an honest woman. She knew it would not be simple. Port Charles rarely afforded for simple resolutions. But for the first time in what seemed like an eternity, Willow was actually seeing, genuinely smelling, and truly ready to battle, not against Michael, not for Drew, but for herself and most importantly, for the well-being of her precious children. The road to atonement would be long and tough, with painful facts and demanding apologies, but Willow, now awake, was ready to walk it. The dramatic chapter of her life with Drew was coming to an end, and a new, more honest, albeit challenging, chapter was about to begin, one in which her emphasis would finally return to the pure, unadulterated love she felt for her children, free of external pressures or personal ambitions. The crisp morning air in Port Charles, which is generally a respite from the city's continual undercurrent of drama, was especially charged as the week of June 16th to 20th began. Whispers in the wind foreshadowed huge changes in the lives of numerous key residents, as revealed in the GH Spoilers weekly update. Willow Tate was at the center of one coming seismic event, about to unleash a bombshell that would resonate through the lives of both the Corinthos and Quartermain families. Her journey had been riddled with difficulties, including escaping a cult, suffering cancer, and navigating the tumultuous seas of a messy divorce and custody dispute with Michael. Her recent decisions, notably those involving Drew Kane, Michael's uncle, have been met with public and familial condemnation. Their contentious affair, which was captured on a nanny cam and later leaked, as well as her seeming readiness to follow Drew's increasingly vengeful lead, alienated many and led in Michael being granted full custody of their children, Wiley and Amelia. The bomb she was going to drop was not another appeal, another desperate legal tactic to recoup what she had lost in court. Willow, in a rare moment of clarity that seemed to pierce through the veil of recent months, was about to announce a significant shift in direction. The decision did not come easily. Sleepless nights were spent staring at the ceiling, revisiting disagreements, Michael's heartbroken expression, Sasha's silent strength, and her children's innocent laughter. She'd recognized, with a crushing sense of remorse, that her pursuit of a happy ending with Drew had unknowingly thrown her children into further stress. Drew's influence had grown, his desire for vengeance against Michael and the Quartermains overshadowing any genuine concern for the children's safety. He had urged her to fight, to malign Michael, and to ignore the clear toll the custody dispute was having on Wiley and Amelia. Willow recalled Sasha's quiet remarks from their previous conversation at the boathouse, in which Sasha, despite her own anguish, wished Michael well and expressed a genuine desire for his happiness. It was in stark contrast to the animosity Drew cultivated. Drew's conscience was gnawing at her after learning that she had pondered desecrating Quartermain graves to spite Tracy, as well as her own odd lack of outrage at the moment. She recognized the reality about who Drew had become, and more terrifyingly, who she was becoming by uniting with him. Willow's bomb was her decision not to appeal Michael's complete custody. Instead, she would publicly commit to a different approach: collaborative co-parenting. Willow requested that the announcement take place at a small, private gathering at the Quartermain mansion. Michael, hesitant yet hopeful following their recent talk, agreed. Drew was present, his countenance a combination of forced optimism and barely veiled stress. Carly, Sunny, Monica, and Olivia were all present, along with the rest of the extended family, who had seen the custody struggle unfold with varied degrees of anguish and judgment. Willow stood in front of them, her voice quivering slightly but remaining firm. She did not mince words. She admitted her past faults, her intransigence, and how her decisions had impacted everyone, particularly the children. She emphasized the necessity of stability for Wiley and Amelia, prioritizing their needs over her own wishes or external demands. Then she dropped the argument. I will not be appealing the custody decision. Michael has been awarded full custody, and I accept that. My focus now is on working with Michael, respectfully and cooperatively, to ensure Wiley and Amelia have a peaceful, loving environment with both of their parents. There was a tremor in the room. Drew's expression crumpled in astonishment and fury, which was swiftly disguised. Michael's visage softened, and a gleam of relief replaced the constant tension he carried. Carly let out a quiet sigh, a little prayer of thanks. Willow continued, addressing Michael squarely, her eyes filled with unshed tears. Michael, I am truly sorry for the pain I caused. I want to build a real co-parenting relationship with you, for our children. No more fighting, no more lawyers. Just us, committed to them. It was a deep gesture of submission, not weakness but strength. The atmosphere in the room changed, with a definite sense of stress evaporating and being replaced by a fragile hope. Willow's bomb was not destructive. Rather, it was an act of peace, a desperate attempt to repair the divided family and possibly herself. While Willow dealt with her own turmoil, Emma Drake, a young woman recognized for her sharp mind and sensitive personality, was enjoying a major victory. Emma, who had recently returned to Port Charles and was quickly making an impression with her sharp insights and unyielding sense of justice, had taken on a difficult job. Her win was no trivial triumph. It was a deeply personal success that benefited the entire community. Emma, a conscientious and compassionate student, had been working on a community health initiative, affiliated with General Hospital, that aimed to improve teenagers' access to mental health resources. She had noticed a significant gap in the city's services, a lack of low-cost, easily available bereavement therapy for young people who had lost a parent or close family member. Her own experiences with loss, particularly her mother Robin's believed death, had given her a deep understanding of the long-term consequences of unresolved grief. Her first recommendations were met with bureaucratic resistance, extensive paperwork, and the frustratingly slow pace of institutional change. She had spent hours sifting through statistics, writing grant applications, and pushing hospital executives, her conviction unshakable. She had presented her case to the hospital board, explaining with eloquently and passion the critical need for such services, presenting anonymous tales from youth she had interviewed, and emphasizing the silent agony that many people faced. Her grandmother, Anna Devane, a major figure in Port Charles, had provided silent backing, but Emma's victory was all her own, the result of her hard work and resolve. Emma's win came when she received a big donation from a private organization. Impressed by her rigorous study, engaging presentation, and steadfast dedication to the cause, the award was sufficient to cover the costs of a year-long trial program for a dedicated teen bereavement counseling facility at General Hospital. Emma's sheer force of will and the overwhelming data she presented convinced the hospital board to approve the proposal, despite their initial reservations. The news arrived in the form of an email, which simply verified the funds. Emma read and reread it, a gentle smile creeping across her face. This wasn't simply a triumph for her. It was a victory for thousands of young people in Port Charles who would finally have a secure place to grieve their grief. She instantly sought out her father, Patrick, and Robin, her face beaming with pride. They hugged her hard, beaming proudly. Later, she informed her closest friends, including Spencer Cassadine, who had also suffered a significant loss, and Trina Robinson, who understood the subtleties of grieving. Emma's victory was not a spectacular confrontation or a surprising revelation. Rather, it was the calm, profound joy of seeing her efforts convert into actual life-changing results. It highlighted her knowledge, compassion, and increasing maturity. It cemented her reputation as a force for good in Port Charles, a young woman destined to make a huge positive difference in the lives of others, motivated by her own compassionate understanding and unflinching determination. This wasn't a one-time win. It was a foundational achievement that pointed to Emma's bright future, one in which her brilliance and compassion would continue to shine brightly, creating a lasting legacy. Her victory struck a chord with many people, serving as a reminder that positive change is possible in a city that is frequently plagued by gloom and sorrow. Meanwhile, Joe's youthful discovery collided with a shattering truth when he overheard a conversation that would forever change his understanding of his past. The prior earful had created the groundwork by disclosing that he was adopted. Now fate, in its cruelest form, conspired to have him learn the entire terrible details of his true ancestry. The scene transpired late one afternoon in the calm, presumably private confines of the Quartermain living room, rather than in a noisy coffee shop. Gio had arrived home early from a study group, intending to get a snack before going to his room. His cousin Brooke Lynn and Aunt Lois could be heard in the living room, speaking quietly yet urgently. The same two women who had previously hinted at his adoption were now having a furious, emotional debate. He came to a halt in the hallway unseen as he heard Lois exclaim, her voice quivering, "Brooke Lynn, you must tell him the truth. He deserves to know that Dante is his father." The word struck Gio with the power of a physical blow, sucking air from his lungs. Dante. Not just Dante Falconeri, the detective and his mother's friend, but also the man with whom he had recently clashed over Rocco's drinking incident, a man who had stared him down with hard, accusatory eyes. The man he now recognized was his biological father. Brooke Lynn, the cousin he adored and who was always there for him, was his mother. The revelation tore through his carefully crafted reality. He wasn't simply adopted. He was Brooke Lynn and Dante's hidden child, abandoned and nurtured by others while his own parents lived just kilometers away, seemingly unaware of his existence. He heard Lois tell the story in fragmented lines, piecing together a terrible narrative. Brooke Lynn had been young, afraid, and overwhelmed when Lois interfered, arranging the adoption and keeping the secret to protect Brooke Lynn's future. "It was intended to be for the best, Gio," Lois exclaimed, seemingly ignorant of his presence, "to provide you a secure existence and to safeguard Brooke Lynn from a scandal. Your adoptive parents loved you so much, but then they were gone." Joe's tears poured silently and hotly down his face. His rage was a raging fire in his chest. How could they? How could his own mother and grandma hide such a huge secret and let him live a lie for years? He recalled every casual conversation with Dante, every time he referred to Brooke Lynn as his cousin. It was all a show, a well-staged fake. He felt a strong feeling of betrayal, a deep, agonizing wound that extended beyond the shock of adoption. It was the realization that these individuals, whom he loved and trusted, had chosen to intentionally conceal his true identity, creating a false reality for him. He remembered the nurse's ball, where he had played his violin with pride, only to later discover that his life was a lie, prompting him to shatter his violin on stage. The new detail, Dante's paternity, exacerbated the grief tremendously. He'd been so angry at Dante before, and now he realized it was intended at his own father, a guy who had no idea he had another son. The irony was a harsh pill. He wanted to yell, break something, and demand answers. But he remained transfixed, listening to the terrible memories of his own forgotten past. The debate finally switched to how to convey the news to Dante, and how to deal with the expected backlash. Lois displayed guilt, fearing Dante's wrath, and Brooke Lynn, while plainly angry, appeared to be struggling with her own complex feelings, possibly still clinging to the idea of safeguarding her past. Gio couldn't stomach hearing much more. He slid silently out of the house and into the lowering Port Charles dusk. His world had shattered, leaving fragments of his identity scattered like broken glass. This time the overhearing was more than a teaser. It was the decisive moment of truth, the point of no return. His nurse's ball victory, his musical talent, and his burgeoning sense of self all seemed weakened by the weight of this secret. He was no longer simply Gio Palmieri Lois.